Okay. Hello, Hajar. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. It's nice to have you here. So, you've got a book called The Struggle for the People's King. I see the big poster behind you there. That's great. Have you published other books, or is this your first book published?
This is my first published book. I have many books in my head, but this is the one that's out in the world. And it is the culmination of just about 7 years of research and a couple more years of writing. So almost a decade of work has gone into this book.
I see on your bio that you're an assistant professor of sociology. What school do you work at?
I teach at Dornsife at the University of Southern California. So Southern California, just as sunny as you would expect, a beautiful bubble, if you will. But I mean, I grew up on the East Coast, and so this has been my first foray into West Coast living, and it's truly been wonderful. The students are fantastic.
So, why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, I think that's always the question that we should all be asking, right? Is what is the motivation behind these nonfiction books that go out into the world and tell us something about the world around us? And for me, this is a book that comes out of being a scholar who studies social movements and race. And I was in graduate school looking out at the landscape around me. And at the time, there was this really prominent case playing out in the news. And maybe you recall, it was the case of Abigail Fisher. And she was a young white woman who was rejected from the University of Texas at Austin. And she was taking this case to the Supreme Court. So her perception was that she was rejected because she was white, and she felt that the repeal of affirmative action would kind of solve this problem. And I was listening to this language of reverse racism. I was thinking about all of, the sociological evidence that I'd learned about how anti-Black racism was very much not over. And for me, what was so fascinating about the case is that Dr. King's words kept getting invoked by, the folks that were taking the case to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And they were using Dr. King's words. And to me, it seemed like it was turning some of his own goals, his own vision on its head. And so I wanted to understand how it is that Dr. King's words could get misused in this way, and how we got to this moment where affirmative action itself is seen as a form of reverse racism. And so that's really the origin story of the book.
Okay. Well, this is a big topic that I doubt we're going to be able to cover justly in 15 minutes, but we'll give it a shot. There has been a lot of talk about reverse racism, about how affirmative action unfairly pushes people to the top who may be less than qualified to be at the top. Do you think that equity is something that's attainable with human beings? Because I've always questioned that. I've always thought that we all have different skill sets, we all have different strengths and weaknesses, and to bring it to just racial components seems to be cheating all parties out of the right to excel.
I definitely understand the question. And like you said, I mean, like if we could take 3 hours and unpack it, I would be thrilled. I will say this for listeners who, maybe have a knee-jerk reaction and think immediately, well, Dr. King did speak about a colorblind society. I would encourage you to read the book. The Struggle for the People's King really takes us into the long trajectory of how Dr. King's memory becomes institutionalized through the national holiday, how a lot of his radical history, the things that he actually fought for, get stripped from his memory, and then how he gets used in the service of a lot of political projects that he himself and that civil rights movement actually wouldn't have agreed with. And so, when we think about the question of affirmative action, it's really easy to get bogged down by these questions of, is it fair? Does it unfairly benefit certain groups? And we kind of miss the larger context, which is a history that has historically pitted us against one another by using symbols like Dr. King, by making us believe that he himself, in his quest for eradicating anti-Blackness from society, his quest for making sure that we all could stand on equal ground with equal dignity, to have, roofs above our heads, to be able to feed our families, some of these larger goals, that they do get lost when we get down into the kind of politicization of some of these questions that actually I think we would all agree on if we kind of understood the root causes.
Is the book primarily about him?
This is the interesting thing. So I say this in the introduction that I'm not a historian. I'm a sociologist, and the book is not a history. The book is a study of the political remaking, the political uses of his memory. And so for anyone who's heard his words get invoked in political speeches, we've seen him compared to Donald Trump. We've seen him compared to Malcolm X. All across the political spectrum, we've seen him used in all sorts of different ways. So this is really a book about how that happens and then why it matters. And so one of the big findings in the book is, one, that co-opting and distorting his memory has actually been an intentional political strategy. And then the second big takeaway is that it's had a lot of really dangerous consequences for our capacity to work together as Americans and to envision a collective future. So this isn't just a book for folks who are interested in history or folks who are interested in politics. It's really a book for anyone who's concerned about all of our deep divides and this question of how we move forward together.
What are we doing wrong in this country right now to move forward together? Because we don't seem to be doing that at the moment. We seem to be like a fork in the road, and half the country is going one way and half is going the other way. Well, what are we doing wrong?
Yeah, I mean, that again, I'm like, how many hours you got? But I think the real thing that I think we should remember is that part of a politics that roots power in a very small percent of the population, right? I think it's really easy to get, stuck in this idea that it's just political parties that are, one side, the other side, this is the big divide. That's kind of been the project for the 0.1% at the top who actually has the power. And so this is where I'm always saying, let's not think about it as a Democrat issue versus Republican issue. It is much deeper than that. This is really a project where it pits communities against one another. It makes us feel powerless as individuals. It makes us forget that we're social beings, right? So as humans, we're not supposed to be living in these isolated families where we don't talk to one another. We're supposed to be in community with one another. So that's really where, to me, some of the issue lies, is that it's not just been kind of a natural function of economy and technology, and now we're all just on our phones and not talking to each other. It's been that the politics from the top has been really effective at making us believe that people are against us and that we are against them, and that other people forge this existential threat to us. And I think that's really what you get when you look at a deeper and longer history, when you really learn the past, which is really the case I'm making in the book, is that we can't let these revisionist histories take hold. We have to understand how once we look at that long trajectory, we realize we're not alone. This is not the first time these deep divides have happened. We've gotten through, but only by leaning on one another and really forging these deep bonds within our communities around us.
Well, I certainly don't remember a time that the country was this divided in my lifetime. Reading about the Civil War, I would say, yeah, it was probably that divided in 1860. The only thing I can take away from all of this as to why is technology. And you mentioned that about everybody on their phones. But it does provide a certain barrier for people. You talked about communication. You talked about talking to each other. We did that as kids because we didn't have smartphones and we didn't have internet. We had to talk to each other. Sometimes we got into arguments. Sometimes we got into fights. Sometimes we hugged each other. But there was real human communication. I think the myth of technology is that the internet was supposed to bring us all together because it connected the world. And that was the dream. That was what I thought was going to happen. That didn't happen. And in fact, it went the other way. And I'm baffled as to why.
Yeah, I hear you. And look, I'm a Zennial, so I'm one of these old millennials who did grow up with no internet. We didn't have smartphones. If we wanted to play, you went to the next house over and knocked on the door and asked if they were home. So, I share that sentiment that technology has played some role, but from the sociological standpoint, right, from the folks that, have studied this over time, technology has really played a small role in the division that we see now. I think a big part of it is, you also have to look at how the economy has been restructured in, like the last 60 years. You think about the fact that folks used to have these stable factory jobs. They could go to their workplace, work a 9 to 5, and then come home and have dinner with their family. They could spend their evenings hanging out with folks in the neighborhood. Weekends were spent doing these social activities. This is the
Yeah.
core argument of Robert Putnam in his foundational book, Bowling Alone. And this is really the idea that because the economy has been restructured, because now you have to work incredibly long hours to have a living wage. You don't have the benefits that you used to. Families are under an immense amount of pressure and stress in ways that they weren't 60 years ago. A lot of these changes are not just because we have new technologies. It's because the world around us has changed and we don't have governments that have really caught up. And it's really, one of these sociological, I think, ideas is that folks think, oh, well, you're just blaming the structures all the time. There's no individual responsibility built in. I always want to be really clear that the whole point of sociology is understanding how to connect our individual experiences to the larger social forces that shape our lives. And so that's, again, where I think taking the historical outlook really helps us understand that there are all these moving parts in the world around us that have made our individual lives just a lot harder than they used to be.
Well, you're right about one thing, that back in my childhood, most of the families were single income, and that is not the norm anymore. And that started long before iPhone.
It's not. No, it's not. And I've seen, it's interesting too. I've seen a lot of women I know, highly educated, had high career aspirations, leave their careers to be stay-at-home mothers, not because they wanted to. I know some that chose to because they truly loved it and wanted to, but because the cost of childcare is so immense that financially it actually doesn't make sense for them to work because the cost of childcare, is actually greater than the amount they would have made at their jobs. And so again, I mean, if we want to think about our ideal world, because that's always the question I want to ask, is not the question of politics. It's not the question of, which ideology do we want to sort of abide by. It's really the question of how do we see our ideal world? Like, what does the good life look like? And to me, the foundational good life is one where you can take care of your family, where you can breathe, right? You're not constantly under the pressure of trying to put dinner on the table at night, pay for your mortgage or your rent at this point, right? So I think these are some of the deeper questions that all of us, I believe, really at our cores understand. And I think those are the ones that could bring us together to really mobilize for some fundamental structural changes that would help everybody.
Well, on that note, we're going to have to wind this down. We've just gone right through our 15 minutes. The book is called The Struggle for the People's King. Is the book out now?
It's out everywhere books are sold.
Okay. And the last question is, do you have a website that you want to give out?
I do, yes. Please come visit me at www.hajaryazdiha.com. And I'm on Instagram and formerly known as Twitter as well.
Okay. Well, Hajar, thank you so much for coming on. This was a nice conversation. I know we could have gone on. Best of luck with the book. I hope it does well.
Thank you so much for having me.